I'm Corey, and this is the Hardcore Skeptic Examines. Okay, so wow, this has been a long time between episodes. I put out the interview with Donna Barker on implicit bias about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It had a great response, but it's getting quite a bit of time between episodes now. I think I learned a lot from that episode and that interview, and I had a lot of listeners' feedback that said that they really thought it was good too. This episode is my interview with the great Alix Jules. He's been on a number of shows in the recent past, including 2 appearances on Serious Inquiries Only, a few on Angry Black Rant, and he has in the past been on the Thinking Atheist and Dogma Debate. This interview is a bit dated, I guess. I recorded it back in March or April, somewhere in there. It's a result of the way I did stuff, which is something, a mistake I'm not going to make for future subjects when I start learning about other things. But because this is old, we didn't cover recent events, Charlottesville, or the disturbing rise of the alt-right and the re-emergence of Nazis. These are things that people have covered very well on other podcasts. You can find out about fighting racism on podcasts like Politicos, or the Resist podcast, or the Utah Outcasts, and any number of other shows. They're up to date and have new information. This interview with Alix, though, is about the way things were before Charlottesville. And maybe you can see the writing on the wall in the way that Alix and I talk about racism and social issues back in March, or whenever I recorded them. Some people have been saying that this overt racism still exists and has been bubbling below the surface. They've been saying this for a long time. Some people could have predicted an event like Charlottesville was going to happen, and in fact, I think some people did predict not that particular event, but like events like that would happen. But anyway, that's a whole other train of thought. Here's my interview with Alix Jules on racism. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so I guess we'll start over. Why don't you introduce yourself over again?
Okay, sure. Hi, my name is Alix Jules, and I'm a writer, activist, and social critic and commentator, and I'm based in Dallas, Texas. I am the president and organizer for Black Nonbelievers of Dallas. I hold various affiliations with various groups, including the Center for Inquiry, the African American for Humanism initiative within the Center for Inquiry, and the Black Humanist Association, which is an initiative part of the AHA, the American Humanist Association. I am also a blogger. You can find me on Atheist at the Graffiti Wall, and also on The Orbit on my self-titled blog, Alix Jules.
Very cool. So I guess because this subject is social justice, I'll start with the question that seems to have a bunch of different answers. So what is social justice?
Well, social justice is usually meant trying to find, and the Greeks defined it really early, trying to find a balance between the majority and the minority, trying to flatten out the levels of justice to make sure that everyone has the same rights and privileges. If you really boil it down to just those fundamental ideas, it's that. And it's also a critical analysis of how we treat the minority. And that's where a lot of people tend to get hung up on. Right. Because the minorities tend to, and we can define the minority as a special interest group, or people that are just different. The minority tends to not have power. And how do we critically examine how we treat the people who don't have the power, that don't hold the power, and do they, or are they afforded the same rights as the masses?
That's actually a really interesting way of explaining it. I don't think that I've heard it put quite that way before. So I guess when we're talking about minorities, how we treat minority groups as the majority, how does that, or different organizations fall into that? Like, how do things like Black Lives Matter or feminism or LGBTQ organizations fall into that?
Well, that tends to be where things break down, because as organisms, as society, contributors or members of this massive organism that we call a culture, we tend to be very resistant to change. We like the status quo, especially if you have power. Why would you want to give any of that up and potentially empower the other classes? You know, there's always a hierarchy. Sometimes it's a caste system, and we even see that here. So, given our history here in the U.S., where we've had things such as racism, segregation, we still have racism, segregation, in various different points of oppression on this big axis of oppression. And when we start talking about, at least in academia, intersectionality and measuring those points of oppression, when you look at that, all of these organizations represent some form of minorities that are asking for some variation of equality. Sometimes it's absolute equality, which is what the civil rights movement and the civil rights movement before that were asking for, whether it's the Federalist Papers, whether it was emancipation, we're asking to be treated equally. Now, when you get into organizations such as Black Lives Matter, they have a very specific goal and mission. And originally it was talking about the police brutality that they were seeing, the unequal treatment of minorities when it came to policing, which has been studied and it's been documented. And it tends to be non-controversial unless you begin to try and pick apart the statistics and try and create your own narrative. But if you give those statistics context, a lot of what they're demanding actually makes sense. And that is stop killing us. I mean, that's flat out, just stop killing us.
Right.
Do you treat other people the same way that you treat this particular minority group when it comes to policing? And the answer is no. We know that's not true. We know that many of the populations, the minority populations, are over policed. Just the numbers, and even if you kind of rationalize the crime rates, and you'll still find that in some areas you have 3 to 7 times as many police officers per minority versus a similar crime infested area, across those tracks where it's not a minority group. You just don't see the same thing. And of course, in America, that has some historical significance.
Right. So some of the arguments that I've heard in this regard like to say that many of these issues are economic issues rather than racial issues. And I wonder how one addresses that kind of criticism.
It's kind of hard to not look at them all in America specifically, because I do talk about these issues sometimes overseas, and people bring their different experiences, and people want to talk about, Marx's idea on economic class versus critical race theory, which we have, it picks up on the idea of Marxism and class theory, but it really examines where race and economics really does intersect. They became almost at the inception of the United States, they became intertwined. And so when we start talking about economics and, hey, let's make sure everyone is doing better, and then you'll see the minorities treated better, et cetera, that's simply just not the case. And when you start looking at the ways we've kind of piecemealed people's identities, et cetera, this is what Black is, this is what white is. There's always been, again, a caste system, especially in the States, going from, again, the inception of the United States all the way into, we were arguing about it in the 60s when we had the civil rights, not just the civil rights movement, but the Civil Rights Act, et cetera. And then you pushed into things like the Fair Housing Act, and we're still seeing things that are not differentiated by economic class, but by race. Yes, you can tie the two together, but you can't eliminate that other variable, which is a confounding variable. It's no longer an independent variable in this equation.
Right.
It is the issue of race. So it doesn't really hold water. And I know a lot of people have tried to talk economics. We've had in and out of various movements. We've had people bring in even people like Thomas Sowell, who's an economist who likes to talk about Black empowerment, but he also likes to talk about the economic issues that are holding down the Black community, et cetera. He talks about the model myth, the model minority, which is really the immigrant population. And he creates these wonderful dynamics that work on paper. And again, they feed a one-sided narrative. But when you bring in the sociological context of it all, it tends to break down.
Right. Yeah, like once you apply, it's almost like looking at all the variables. Once you start looking at everything that's going on, it's hard to eliminate race as a factor.
Right. It's like, like anything in science. If you look at it through multiple lenses and through multiple interdisciplinary lenses, and you, instead of just looking at an economist for an answer and say, oh, it's poverty driven, and it's economics, like, but wait a minute, is it really that? Well, you bring in a historian to the table, a sociologist to the table, a psychologist to the table, and have a real discussion on it. And you'd be amazed what actually comes up in, well, number one, primarily educating the economist who's ignorant of all these other issues.
Right.
And so, again, bringing in all these social theories, even the idea of murder being something that is almost endemic. And we heard the narrative here in the U.S. during not just the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, but with the rise of the alt-right. We heard a massive backlash that, blacks are just criminals, black are just criminals. But we don't talk about the reinforcing of the stereotypes that have been there and the tropes that exist or coexist with them that have been there since the 1600s.
Right.
They've been in media forever, whether they're true or not, and most of them are not, they're still there. And so we're not taking those down. We're reinforcing a lot of these ideas. It's just like police. Police may never have any real interaction with Black people inside of their neighborhood. So they go out there. And this is also one of the arguments for community policing. So people go out there and the only interaction they have with Black people it's usually a crime or cry for help. So they don't know that Black people aren't always like this. And so they create this heuristic of this is what Black people do. And if this is how you're just continuously exposed to these ideas, when you actually do run into a Black person, that's the first thing that you're thinking. How is this person a threat, et cetera? So again, some of it is psychological, some of it are pieces of society, and some of it is biological.
This morning I just interviewed a person who works in studying implicit bias, and that sounds very much like some of that. Like we've been fed this narrative, we've been socialized to see things a particular way, and then it's been so long fed that we've been fed this that we don't consciously think of people in a certain way, but we think of people in a certain way.
Absolutely. And they do become intrinsic to who we are. They do become biological. We know that when we start examining fear centers, the amygdala, and we've done tests on the associated regions of the brain on how we create those biases or how we mitigate those biases, we know that the amygdala is triggered. Even with people who say that they hold no biases, when we put them under an fMRI and we start looking at the brain, we start testing them, it's like they're still there. Right. Now, of course, there are ways that we can mitigate those using other parts of the brain and through exposure, but it takes the first thing is being honest about it. And that's where we're still struggling with in the U.S. We're still not honest about it. 40 years ago, we weren't honest about it then. I remember seeing a wonderful debate between James Baldwin and William Buckley. And in that debate, William F. Buckley was basically saying that the black man is the problem. He is holding himself back. And as we measure what the actual oppression was in that time frame, how can you say that? And then you fast forward 40 some odd years and the same argument still holds true. And William F. Buckley would probably be not conservative enough for many people out there today. So look at that when we're trying to argue how much progress we've made, we kind of have to balance that not just with the actual progress that we made, but the perceptions that continue to hold us back and not allow us to continue to push and make further progress.
Yeah, one of the subjects that was brought up this morning was the idea that at some point in pop culture, they started portraying black men in roles of authority in, say, hospitals or whatever. And so people started imagining that was real, like that was really happening. And it didn't, when you looked at the statistics, wasn't really representative in that way. But people imagined that racism was over all of a sudden.
Yeah. Post-racial America, and the same can be said about Obama. You had Obama come up, and all of a sudden, because you have a black president, racism is completely gone.
Right. I've heard that from a couple of different interviews, like people who said, well, you can't say that racism is a big issue in America when there was a black man as the president. And I
love that argument because I look at the 6.5 years of obstruction. I won't give it a full 8. So, right. 6.5, 7 years maybe of obstruction from a different party that argued against them for no other reason than possible race.
Right.
Oh no, we didn't like his policies, etc. Okay, that's fine. You don't like his policies. Okay, good. Let's say that race has absolutely nothing to do with it, and then let's take a look at the current incarnation of the president today. Are you going to tell me that he is not a wonderful portrayal of what privilege is?
Right.
Even if you don't believe in privilege, it's like, oh, wait, you have a wonderful shining example there who is homophobic. I mean, there's so many isms when it comes to him. I mean, I can't list them. I mean, I'll be here forever.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating because I've said it a couple of times on podcasts and I can't say it enough. America was, before the election, no, we will not elect Donald Trump. We're simply not that racist. America, right? America after Donald Trump was, well, okay, we elected him, but we're still not racist.
It's not because we're racist.
It's not because we're racist. That had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Had nothing to do with it. It's like, that's wonderful. It's like, can you be any more pedantic? But it goes to show that we don't like to. Here's something. The word racism is a very toxic word. You call someone racist and they freak out. They just no, I'm not racist. It's like you're wearing a white hood and you have gasoline in both your hands. The guy behind you has a torch, but you're telling me that you're not racist. Seriously, David Duke, former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, when someone told him he was racist, he's like, no, I'm not racist.
He's not racist. He just thinks white people are superior.
Right. Like a few congressmen who have outed themselves recently. Yeah. This isn't just, the bird wing of the Republican Party anymore. We're talking about Midwestern Republicans that, hey, I thought that was just a Southern thing, and you just go a little bit, into the Midwest and Arkansas, and you can listen to Klan radio that is still broadcasting still today, but it has nothing to do with
race. There's no racism though. Hey,
right. America.
I guess. What do you think of the concept of racism as prejudice plus power? Is that useful, or is that something that is only useful in academia? Or
I think I'm a little bit of a pragmatist when it comes to that to that idea. I think that when talking to other activists, we know exactly what that means. Privilege plus power, that's real racism. But when you try and argue against it with an opponent or even someone that you're trying to reach, it has very little value. It has very, very little value because immediately they're going to become defensive. So when I'm talking to other people outside of either academia, outside of an activist circle, outside of, certain movements, and there are several of them, outside of certain movements, the word racism does not really come up too much for me. I try not to, because that's going to trigger them.
Right.
And I mean, in the worst way, right? The conversation stops. I try not to talk about privilege or try and talk about privilege in something that's a little bit more substantive and meaningful to them, because many people will argue that privilege doesn't exist. I was a poor white blah, blah, blah that was raised in Louisiana or Oklahoma or Texas, at the back on the end of a backwood of a trailer and blah, blah, blah. Are you going to tell me that I am better off than that Harvard educated Negro over there? What did you just call him? But the question is, if you dress the same and you two walk into a 7-Eleven, or one person decides that they're going to drive on your side of town, who has a higher chance of getting stopped by the police for absolutely no reason? We know that driving while black is a real thing. Yeah. And it's not just within the heavy dominant black populations. It just happens everywhere. And again, it happens where there are no black people as well. You drive through some places in Mississippi, Alabama, it's like, those are not safe places. There used to be, it was called the Green Book. And I think that the Green Books should have never gone away. But the many postal workers, many travelers used to use what's called the Green Book, which was used in 30s, 40s, 50s. And I think they started kind of fading away in the 70s. But these were documents, books that talked about where it was safest for black people to travel. And you didn't want to travel by yourself in some areas. And there's please stay away out of that. And we're talking about, people seem to forget that when we talk about minorities, the African-American numbers versus the general population, African-Americans are only 13% of the population.
Right.
That's roughly 1 in 10. If you've got 10 people in a room, and many white people believe that they are oppressed or they're victimized or they are victims of racism. Not kidding. They are more oppressed than black people. And you take a look at the actual power dynamics. Is it a financial fear? I mean, do black people have more money than white people? Well, no, that's just not true. Do they have more political power, more political clout? Well, no, just look at Congress and that's not true. You take a look at the governorships and you don't even have representation there. Not anywhere near. You would expect to at least see 13%, blacks here, there, and blah, blah, blah. When that doesn't actually happen. And we know it's gerrymandering and blah, blah, blah. And many states have been called out by the Supreme Court, including mine in Texas.
Right.
That was racial gerrymandering. No. See, you just got, in the 60s, you couldn't manage your own voting. It was wrong. And we gave you a little bit of runway, and instead you decided to turn it into rope and hang yourself. And there again, It's all done. And now it looks like they're going to continue some level of oversight for states like Texas, who can't be trusted to not be racist.
Right.
Can you please just not be racist? No, Texas, you can't. Neither can Alabama or Mississippi, and Florida, likes to fly their wonderful little flag as well. So the Confederacy, or the new Confederacy never really died. They just evolved. And so when we start again, when you start talking about the power dynamics and the 1 in 10 in that room, and 9 people saying, or any number of that, but 9 saying that they feel oppressed, that they feel victimized by the one guy with the invisible gun that everyone knows is full of nothing. It's a non-bullet. And so how is this person victimizing you? And what it winds up being, and this is where we cross into social justice, it winds up being words. And we use big, nasty words that people don't like the word racism. And because that makes you feel bad. Right. And I get it, because, doesn't matter what color your hood is, you still don't like the word racism.
Don't want to feel bad.
Don't want to feel bad. It's like, well, if you put out that cross behind you, maybe I'll stop calling you racist.
Right.
But it sometimes it's too obvious for some people. And racism has changed. It's evolved. It has morphed with society. Yes, we're still seeing Black people profiled. They deal with stereotype issues. They, even when, again, controlled for education and everything else, we see that you still need things like affirmative action because they're passed over. We saw it with just playing the name game with many of them. Black sounding names. If you remove a black sounding name and you show a resume,
yeah,
you're hired.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, what just happened? It's just the name. So the associations are still there. And those are, wonderful societal, sticking points and hurdles that continue to be a case. So the name or the word racism is scary and ooh, don't call me a racist or you're going to elect a racist? Yeah. Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah. That seems to be happening anyway.
Did it anyway. Well, that's where the argument kind of falls short. It's like, so if I didn't call you a racist, you would have not voted for Trump? Come on now.
Right.
Really? Right. You're going to say that with a straight face. No, you're not. So
that kind of speaks to the idea, like some of the criticism that I've heard on social justice is that it's separating people into race, gender, or sexual preference when previously they weren't, sort of thing. Like it was when.
But this goes to the perception of there being equality, and this is where I start with, if all things were equal. Now, if you preface it with that, if all things are equal, then maybe that's true. Maybe we shouldn't be calling you a racist. Maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Maybe we shouldn't be doing that. But that's a really it's a fallacious premise. It's faulty. It's not right. And when we get into the comparative analysis of oppression, and the 3 white people out of that audience of 10 that say, "Oh, I'm being discriminated against," how exactly are you being discriminated against? Are we talking about employers because blacks aren't in a position of power at most jobs? Are we talking about corporations, corporate leaders, managers, executives? No, that's not really happening. So when you begin to challenge those perceptions, they're still very resistant to that because, again, those words are scary. Now, there are some criticisms against using those words, and that's why I kind of walk around it if it's someone that I'm trying to really have a good dialogue with. Yeah. It's like, okay, let's talk about stuff that does matter. And you find that you can find a lot of commonality. And then when we have some level of rapport and I start introducing facts and start asking them those questions, and what do you think that is? Oh, well, systemic racism might be true, but show me a place in the U.S. that is still segregating either by employment or by education. And I'd love to bring up the fact that just this year in Mississippi, it was actually 2016, and they challenged it in 2017. But in Mississippi, the last desegregated school district in Columbus, Mississippi, that just happened. They literally just desegregated.
Really?
They challenged it, and they were going to mount another case. And in January of 2017, they said, okay, no, we're not. It was like, whoa, nice. Joined the 19th century. No, not okay. So yeah, these are, but segregation is still a massive problem in the U.S. And, when we start saying all things are equal, but they're not, and because we're so segregated, a lot of the opportunities don't exist. And many of these issues are hyper-regional. And so you wind up seeing big cases in New York and big cases in California, and where you see dense populations of African Americans, et cetera. And you're like, well, this is an epidemic. Well, it might be an epidemic in those areas. And then you go into some other areas and it's like, oh, it's fine there. It's like, no, it's not really fine. No one's watching because the 10 Black people that you have are scared out of their minds and they don't leave their homes. So,
right.
Yeah.
I suppose something that I've noticed that when we bring up racism, people often like to cite examples of bad behavior by people of color or examples of sexism by women. What do you think their intent is when they do that, or what are they accomplishing?
It's the consummate red herring. It is, I tell people all the time, it's like, no, for people that are always telling Black people that they need to be accountable for their behavior, you really are dodging here. No, when I hear the statistics about, Blacks are the highest crime, it's like, okay, so let's actually talk about that. Are we going to talk about over-policing? Are we going to talk about the justice system in that discussion? Because we have studies after studies. And I mean, it's no longer controversial to say that a Black person who was convicted, a Black man who was convicted of rape might be there for 20 years or may never leave, and a white Stanford swimmer gets a couple of months. Are you really going to argue that?
Yeah, no, that's pretty apparent, isn't it?
Well, and of course people are like, oh, that's just an exception. No, that's an example, not an exception. It is an example. And again, when we look at the criminal justice system, we see sentencing that can be threefold the numbers. That affluenza kid, and I don't even want to talk about him anymore. But again, it's like, oh, I'm just going to hit a couple of brown people and I'm going to walk away and say that it's because I was so privileged, because I was so rich that I have no morals. I don't know what wrong is. It's like, so you elected him to the presidency of the United States. That's what he did.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So privileged he doesn't know the right from wrong. Yeah, no, that's actually a good description of Trump.
Totally makes sense. It's like, I almost bought it with that one. It's like, oh, that's it. That's the original affluenza kid right there.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess, yeah, what do you, I had one of my guests, I guess he gave me a whole bunch of examples of bad behavior by founders of Black Lives Matter, or where he gave one example of an anti-Semite speaking at a Black Lives Matter event. I wonder if you can speak to maybe whether or not that is an issue in the group.
Well, I'll say this. Black Lives Matter is an unorganized group. It's an unorganized organization, or I should say, loose affiliations within that group. And there are leaders, quasi-leaders, pseudo-leaders, etc., people from a lot of different backgrounds. Some of them are not, great speakers. Some of them do harbor their own biases based on their upbringing, etc. That's exactly what you would expect. Now, one, I'm going to do exactly what they're doing by trying to discredit an organization by a faction. It's like, okay, if you're going to quote one particular chapter and one particular leader of Black Lives Matter, let's say even in Canada, I remember what happened there. Right. That called Justin Trudeau a white supremacist. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
If you want to,
perfect, but I don't know if he'd be
it was a white supremacist. But I'm listening. Please, I want to hear this. But so I look at that and I was like, okay. After we're done with having that conversation, let's talk about Representative King, who is an elected official, who's gone through American schooling, who literally says that we should not be mixing babies, and he's against miscegenation. In 2016 and 2017, he was on national TV as an elected official who said that the white race is the only race that's contributed to any kind of civilization.
I think I remember hearing that. Yeah,
this was last year, on air during the Republican National Convention, and then fast forward again just a couple of weeks ago, not even 30 days, in March, and he's talking about if we want to preserve the race, we shouldn't be having other people's babies. And, oh, by the way, there won't be a race wars because the black people and the brown people will turn on each other and kill themselves. So we won't have this problem later in life. Roughly, that's paraphrasing. So if you want to talk about a non-elected official, someone who is definitely a byproduct of that particular environment, because you're not going to hear the same kind of conversation at every single Black Lives Matter event, etc.
Right.
And sometimes the leaders tend to distract from the overall causes, which is kind of a problem because the way that BLM was initially imagined, it was, without leaders. It was managed by the people out in the streets and grassroots, which, by the way, had a wonderful benefit. Historically, African-American leaders in the civil rights movement have been targeted.
Right.
Whether it was the Black Panthers, whether they were targeted by the FBI, CRA, you had Fred Hampton that was literally killed in his sleep. You had other people that were assassinated and people never brought to justice, or they were just flat out targeted by the people and or if the government. I mean, we know that the government knew about assassination plots. And this is not conspiracy. Well, it is, kind of a revealed conspiracy.
Not conspiracy theory in the way we make fun of it.
Theory. It's not conspiratorial. It is an after fact. And that's also one of the reasons why I have a hard time with conspiracy theorists, because they'll throw that right back as, you're an anti-vaxxer. It's like, yes, you're an anti-vaxxer. You shouldn't be an anti-vaxxer. And they'll look at me as like, as a black person, you can say that? What do you mean? The Tuskegee experiment. I'm like, ugh. I hate it when they do that.
Real conspiracies happened, but
real conspiracies do happen. But when you take a look at the real conversations of why these people are mobilizing in the streets, it's the CNN issue. When there was literal riots going on because of Freddie Gray, which is still an unsolved case, right, which even by the DOJ report, that should never have happened the way that it did. And even with Michael Brown, and it turns out that there was a release, again, less than 30 days ago, of the story that was told by St. Louis, the city of Ferguson, does not match up the video. It doesn't match up the narrative at all.
Okay.
right? And there was a South by Southwest. I don't remember the name of the documentary, but the South by Southwest documentary that released new footage for the documentary that showed that Freddie Gray was in the store earlier on, and there was actually no robbery, so there was never really a need to stop him in the first place, which brings into question all kinds of testimony and what Officer Wilson said, and even Wilson later on showed that he does have bias in some of his statements.
Right.
Again, these are all after the fact, and so you have an example of a conspiracy to cover up, and the government does do that sometimes, not always, sometimes.
It seems like it doesn't have to be like this maniacal overlord conspiracy type thing. Like, if everybody's just looking out for their own self-interest or their own biases, then this stuff kind of happens, right?
Yes, Michael Wood. And let me talk about the CNN thing again. So in the CNN, what I'm referring to is you have the Wolf Blitzers, who is almost losing his mind because people are breaking into CVS or burning down. Actually, he wasn't even upset about burning. He's like, look at all those broken windows. And I'm like, you refuse to talk about why people are actually rioting. And what happened in Baltimore was a little bit more nefarious, because even the riots were triggered because of mismanagement by the police in the city. And it wasn't a true reaction to what happened to Freddie Gray. That's right. When my dear friends, Michael Wood, is an officer from Baltimore, and he's been very public on Young Turks and some other networks talking about what actually happened in Baltimore. And he actually lays out some of the systemic problems in Baltimore. And he started doing that before the Department of Justice report. When you have police officers who may or may not have warrants that walk into a suspect's house, and because they can't find this person, decides that they're going to defecate on this person's bed.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know too many suburbs where this happens.
No way. That is possibly the only case I've ever heard of something like that happening.
Oh, well, you have that. And then in the DOJ report, you have a woman who was pulled over because of an alleged broken tail light, and she got strip searched. How does that, and even by city code and the ordinances, all that is a ticket. There's no justification. And that's not the city of Baltimore's report. That's Department of Justice.
Right.
And so you see that in Baltimore, and you see that also in Ferguson, to the point where I think all the judges were dismissed in Ferguson, and a new judge was appointed, and all the warrants were vacated because the city was found to have predatory and racist actions when it was coming. It was basically just preying on those people. So when you say that, that's the problem with institutionalized racism. It doesn't matter who the actors are. You step into the roles and you fulfill those roles. It's almost manifest destiny that this is going to continue. And when you refuse to either address the problems within the system, or you refuse to educate people on the history on how those systems evolved or came to pass, that's when we find ourselves quite often here today, where you've got people I don't know why this is broken. Well, because you never learned why it exists. Right. Policing from slave patrols, and why exactly you have the concentrations of police and the ratios of police to minority numbers that you have today. There's a very logical reason that happened, and it evolved around that. And yes, it was maniacal then. Is it maniacal now? Well, nobody studies it anymore. They just assume that the isms and the ist are gone, and they walk into these roles and put on the uniform, and they become a tool of this racist system. And then they take it off when it's time to go home, and they walk away, and wash your hands and say, hey, I'm not racist.
It's actually a depressing.
You're welcome. You're welcome. You're very welcome. But that's important. That's important that we acknowledge that in the dialogue. If we're going to address it, we have to first be honest about it.
For sure.
And if we can do that, and I'm always looking for discourse and debate on that particular topic. But the one thing that you don't own is the facts. And it's unfortunate that, and I've had to say this personally before, it's many white people don't know my history. They don't, and my history as a Black person. When I talk about the civil rights struggle, when I talk about the specific cases, when I talk about the development of things like policing in America, or the contributions that African Americans have had in America, not just politics. Did you know that we've had a Black Speaker of the House before? No, nobody. Okay, well, no one ever talks about these things. Right. No one ever talks about these things. But they just because you're white, you're willing to talk to me about race, as if you believe that just because I'm Black, I can do the same thing. Well, sure, that's fine as long as all things are equal, and they're not.
Right.
I study your history, which is a given and mandated in public schools, all public and private schools, and you study mine, which you haven't.
Yep, and that's a fair criticism. I think I've just about used enough of your time, but if actually, I wish I could pick your brain for a long time.
Keep going.
Yeah. I might have to get you set up another interview with you to talk about some of these things, like the start of the policing and like some of these issues.
Did I give you too much?
Yeah, maybe.
I give you too much.
Yeah, maybe. So
make it rain. I'm making it rain.
No, that's great. Like, actually, it's almost a perfect contrast to a discussion I had a couple days ago with a person who is of mixed race, but he lives in Birmingham or near Birmingham, and apparently that's a very African American dominated area, and he cited some very, I don't know, scary examples of what's going on in his area. And I mean, I live in Canada, in Regina, Saskatchewan. I
love Regina because there's a cartoon that's on. It's called Forget About It or something like that, and it's a New York mobster, a gangster who goes through witness protection, and he's relocated to Regina. And it's like that's the first time I heard it's like Regina, and he's always alluding to the fact that Regina sounds like, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the city that rhymes with fun.
Biggest city. That's actually, yes, the city that rhymes.
Yeah. No, right on. So I guess I'll leave it there for now. Is there anything that you think that, like, if there was one thing that people needed to realize about social justice or racism or any of these subjects, what would that be?
I think the first one is don't get hung up on the words. Don't get hung up on the descriptors, the labels, etc. Unless we're really talking about pronouns, and that's a different topic.
Right.
But it's associated. But if we're talking about Black Lives Matter, etc., and there's a whole discussion on Black trans lives and the numbers of trans murders or trans deaths that are happening in the United States, and it's ridiculous. If we're just talking about generally race and that's it, then don't get hung up on the ist and the isms. Try and have the conversation to bring people to a place where you can be, you can make at least the knowledge level equal. That's the only way that you're going to be able to bridge a lot of these gaps and have real substantive dialogue. As soon as someone takes offense, they begin to retreat, they begin to entrench, they begin to run away, is just too much for them. Yeah. And so leave the labels, have the conversations, save them for for academia, save it for the protest, save it for the papers, the think pieces, etc. Sometimes you just have to drop everything else and just get in there. And I know a lot of even African Americans don't like the ideas like, well, I'm tired of educating white folk. Well, you're outnumbered 9-1. So at least some of us are going to have to pick up the slack and like, okay, I'm going to have to go do it. Because I'm also a humanist. And I do believe that eventually, at the end of the day, we're all in this together. It's just we're still arguing about what us is.
Right. Well, that sounds insightful. No, right on. Thanks a lot for talking to me. I guess you already mentioned your blog at the start, but if you have something you want to plug, by all means.
No, I'll just send you the links. It's the graffiti wall. It's Patheos. There's other stuff, but I don't want to take up an appendix in the documentary.
I do. I actually get your an email every time you post on Patheos.
Oh, really?
It's one of those ones that I've got the subscription to. No, right on.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time.
You're very welcome.
So that's my interview with Alix Jules. I wish that I had this out before the events in Charlottesville had happened, or better yet, that the events in Charlottesville had never happened in the first place. I still think there's a lot of value in this discussion. We covered a lot of areas around the general topic of racism and the way society deals with it and racial issues in general. I don't think there's much for me to say now. I have a few links to Wikipedia entries for just some of the background knowledge of things that we discussed. I think there was a real emphasis on one point where Alix mentioned that we as people need to learn about Black history if we want to approach social justice or racial justice in any kind of meaningful way. So if you have any questions about any of the things that were mentioned, then by all means email me about it. You can reach me at mail@brainstormblog.net. You can find more of these episodes at Spreaker.com/show/The Hardcore Skeptic Examines. You can find me on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and just about anywhere else you find podcasts. I'll put links to Alix's blog in the show notes, and maybe I'll post links to some of the shows that he's been on recently too. Like I said, he was on Serious Inquiries Only before, and he's been on Angry Black Rant a few times. So, so that's that. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at Hardcore Skeptic. Like my Facebook page, facebook.com/Hardcore Skeptic. If you want to support my work, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Hardcore Skeptic. Make sure to give me a rating or write a review on iTunes. Share the show all over the place. Got to get the word out on this show. My last episode, even though I haven't put one out in a long time, has still been really doing really well. That implicit bias episode really has had a lot of downloads. It's really getting a lot of support here. So I really want to give a huge shout out to my new patron, Larry Wilson. I really appreciate your support. Thanks very much to my other patrons, Chris Watson of the Podunk Polymath podcast, Marissa Alexa McCool of the Inciting Incident podcast, and Trav Lamone of the By Any Means podcast. Remember to check out my other show, The Brainstorm Podcast, at thebrainstormpodcast.com and brainstormblog.net. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.
Okay. Now, before we start talking, because I've done this, make sure you hit record.
Yep, I got it going. So good.
I've totally done that. I've been halfway in, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe. Yeah. So.
Yeah, just all of a sudden you have nothing.
Yeah. 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 And especially if you're in the middle of it and it's a really good interview and you don't know. It takes me like 5 minutes to figure out, oh my God, how do I tell this person to stop?
Yeah. So far I haven't had to break the news to anybody that the interview was gone or I lost half of it or didn't press record. So
yeah.
So far so good.
All right, let me make sure that, okay, you're saying that I'm coming in not loud and clear? And
yeah, you're very nice and clear now, so.
Okay. I don't have a compressor on this to make my voice go deeper. Burr, burr, burr. So,